What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Brown Motorsports. My name is Truett, and this is my LS Swap Nissan 720 that I've been building a custom triangulated 4-link suspension for. In my last video, I was finally able to get my crossmember all tacked in place. And while it is far from perfect, I am really happy with how it turned out. There are some big gaps. This one is the worst. Not that bad. Nothing a welder won't fix, but overall, it looks really sweet. But now that it's finally in place, we can start playing around with our upper links and where they're going to mount up. These are the mounts that were provided in the kit I bought, but they were meant to weld on the side of the frame here. Since I'm going to be mounting them here, they're going to need some modification. The links themselves are also going to need some modification, as they're about probably 3 or 4 inches too long. By the time they mount there, it's way too long over here, and I want to keep it towards the front side of the axle. Now, one thing I am worried about, since I need to keep the link up off the axle several inches to keep my anti-squat value right, I need to come up with a bracket for those. I was going to use these, which are the old lower brackets for the lower links, which I no longer need, obviously, but I'm not sure they're going to be tall enough by the time I contour them for the axle. But we'll just have to see when we get there. Worst case, I'll make something new. In this video, I'm hoping to get the suspension completely finished out to where I can set the truck back on the ground. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into playing around with these upper links, and I'm going to try to share as much of my thought process as I can. I started by using some scrap wood I had laying around to get the links sitting right about where they needed to be. It wasn't going to be perfect, but it gave me a good idea. I then measured from the ground to make sure that they lined up with my anti-squat calculator. Using some more scrap wood that I cut to a specific height, I made sure that the back of the links were exactly where they needed to be off the axle. I could then start getting a visual for how my front links were going to line up and what angle I was going to have to cut them at. This is also where I needed to decide how far the back of the links were going to be from the seat, making sure I had enough clearance for the tabs. Once again, making sure everything was the proper distance from the ground. I then needed to find the center of my crossmember and also needed to make sure that my crossmember was centered to the truck, which it was perfectly, so I was pretty happy about that. This, of course, is what I needed to use to make sure both my front tabs were perfectly centered. With that in place, I went ahead and put both my links exactly where they were going to be this time, using that line as reference. That way I knew exactly what angle to cut my tabs at, which ended up being, I think, right about 65 degrees. Then it was time to cut into them. I had to be sure to leave enough room for the links to sit and enough room for the bolts to slide in and out without interfering with each other. Now, ultimately, using an angle grinder, everything wasn't going to be perfect, but I think I got it pretty close enough. Then I just needed to mirror it to the other one, get it cut out, and then I could start playing around with where they were going to land on the truck. To do this, I went ahead and used the links themselves, and I got them tightened up that way they were nice and rigid. That way I could put the links where they were going to sit and then just weld the tabs on. Of course, had to clean the crossmember up before I forget, which I'm bad about doing. Using some flat plate, I could make sure that both the mounts were going to stay nice and parallel to the top of the crossmember. Once I was happy with their position, once again checking the back of the links from the distance from the seat, I went ahead and welded them in place. With everything in the way, I was only able to get a few tacks on it, so then I removed everything and finished the tacking. And just like that, they are officially tacked in place. Those 8 little tacks took me about 3 hours, but I had to measure twice, and it was definitely worth it because it looks sweet and everything is nice and centered. So I think I decided I'm going to cut these bars down 3 inches even, and it should work out pretty good. That will bring this joint to about here or so. Now, the way I think I'm going to do this, and for one, I don't know if I mentioned it, but these are threaded on the end, obviously, and the threads end right about here, so I can't chop that off. I have to chop it at the link and then re-weld it back on, but whatever. But for 2, I think I'm just going to go ahead and do 1 bar at a time. I'll come up with some kind of jig to make sure this gets on 90 degrees again, and then I'll weld my tab on, and then I'll do the second bar using these same tabs on this side. That way I know that they're going to be the exact same length. And then finally, I'll be able to weld the tabs on that side, and then that'll be done. Now, I'm actually not upset about having to cut it at the link. As a matter of fact, I was going to weld these anyways, and I will probably be chopping the lower links and re-welding them too, because this cheap kit did not weld them on perfectly 90 degrees. If I were to flip this link, it would actually end up in a little bit different spot over here, so they're not perfectly 90. But once all my tabs are in place, I think I want to weld them back up that way anyways. That way everything is in its exact position, and there's no slight forces shoving something out of whack. Maybe that's just me overthinking, but it's what I'm going to do. It should work out pretty good. So I started by pressing the bushings out because I didn't want them to melt with the heat of the grinding. Now, I didn't really have to use a press. They weren't in there that rigid, but it made my life a whole lot easier. Then it was time to cut the link off. I was trying to be careful doing this because if I cut into the link, it could have ruined some of its integrity. So I just went round and round until it was finally able to snap off. Now, before I cut anything, I decided to make a line down the side of this thing so I could keep its orientation the same. Then I just needed to measure out 3 inches and chop it off. But of course, this flat edge isn't going to line up with the link end, so I needed to contour it again. Using the link as a template, I marked out some lines and then used the angle grinder to grind them off. Also went ahead and beveled the edges while I was here. Then I needed to get rid of the junk on the link ends themselves so they were a nice circle again. Then it was time to tack them back in place, which the setup for this was a little tricky, so I didn't film it, but everything was perfectly 90 degrees, or at least closer than what I had originally. Then I could shove the bushings back in and see how everything lined up. Alright, to me, that looks about perfect. That's right where I wanted it to land. There's enough room for the tabs and the nut and everything to clear the C, but it's pretty centered on the axle and pretty far over. Now I just need to come up with something for these tabs, which need to hold it somewhere about here-ish. Not exactly sure what I want to do here yet, but I've got a couple ideas. Scratch that, I actually know exactly what I'm going to do, and that is to use this, the leftover piece from my cross member, and I've got 2 of them. Since this is a 2x4, it is 2 inches wide, and it happens to fit perfectly over my rod ends. Now obviously went ahead and cut one side off of it so I could see what it was going to look like, but I think it's going to work out perfect. Also went ahead and cut this link bar 1 inch shorter, so it's actually 4 inches short now. It was the same process as last time, so you didn't miss anything. But as you can see, it now lands here instead of where it was right here before on the center of the axle. This will allow me just to get a slightly better angle, something like this or so when it's all done. However, I could stand here and look at this piece of metal all day and have absolutely no idea how to cut it, so I think I'm going to come up with a cardboard template first. I really don't think this should be too bad. I guess we'll see. Well, it took me a little bit of time, but this is what I ended up with. I know it doesn't look like much, but this was actually quite a complicated piece to make. It needs to sit on here at this angle, but it also needs to slide down a little bit to accommodate for the forwardness and still be level right here where my fingers are. This thing definitely isn't perfect, but I think it's pretty close enough. Now I just need to make it out of steel. So this was pretty straightforward. I just had to disassemble the thing I spent days working on, trace it out on the piece of metal, and then do a bunch more cutting. Now if you're disappointed that I didn't film any of the process of me making this template, I actually did the first time and the second time, but once the third time hit, I was just tired of filming and I wanted to get it done because it was actually a really hard piece to come up with. Nevertheless, I finally ended up with some pieces I was happy with, so I was just ready to get them made. Now this was a lot of manual labor with an angle grinder. Trying to turn 2 pieces of box tubing into some nice mounts was kind of a pain, especially considering I wasn't working with any exact dimensions, so I cut everything big, leaving some room for adjustability. Which I'm glad I did, but it just made for a lot of extra work in the end. But once I had a rough shape cut out, I just needed to grind them down to the Sharpie until I was happy with the shape. And this was quite a finesseful process because I didn't want to go too much because I didn't have any more steel on hand. So I slowly worked my way back and forth, checking as I went. Once I was finally to the Sharpie marks and I was happy with it, I went ahead and threw them back on the links so I could see how they were going to land on the axle. And go figure, first try they weren't perfect, so I marked the high spots and did another pass of grinding. Alright, I got it fitting pretty snug all the way around. There's a little bit of gap on that corner, which was hard to do, but it's honestly maybe 1/8 of an inch, so I'm really happy with that. I need to chop a little bit off the front. I did cut it big just to be careful, which will get rid of some of this tail that I don't need. Then I need to figure out how I want to drill this hole, which shouldn't be too hard. But other than that, I'm very happy to see this out of metal finally. I've been staring at cardboard for way too long. Now I was actually kind of nervous to drill this hole because if I was off just a little bit, it would change the angle completely. So I started my mark in the center using one of the tabs just by eyeball for one side. Then I used my caliper to find a good distance to use as a reference. Then I got it scribed in place. Sorry to all the machinists watching this, it's an old pair. Then I used my center punch to have a nice start for the drill bit, flipped it over and used the same measurements to mark the center on that side. Then I used some soapy water to help lubricate and or cool. This probably isn't the most ideal fluid to use, but it was better than nothing because I didn't want to cook my drill bits. I started with a small drill bit to make sure I had them nice and centered and then slowly moved up. Once again, trying to keep them nice and cool so I could get a good cut. It seemed to work out pretty good enough, so I was happy with it. I probably should have invested in some actual cutting oil at some point. And of course, once they were both reamed out to a good enough size, I used the final size drill bit to go all the way through. Then it was time for a test fit, which I was a little nervous for, but the holes actually turned out perfect. However, now that everything was nice and rigid, I noticed there was a little more material that needed to be taken off. And I already had to cut the fronts off, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Then it was just a matter of grinding that extra bit off and trimming the front. Now that this piece was almost done, it was time to go ahead and put a radius on it, because it was going to make it look a whole lot better. I, of course, just used a big socket I had laying around as a template, which was good enough. I decided to just chop the corner off to save myself a little bit of grinding, which I'm glad I did, because there was still a bunch of grinding. However, it is pretty satisfying to use a grinder and watch something like this take shape. I went ahead and threw some bevels on there too for welding. Alright, this piece is all shaped up and done and ready to weld on. However, I think I am going to do a front piece here to kind of box everything in to make it a little bit stronger. And I'm probably going to do a piece that kind of sits in here like that at an angle so that no dirt or anything gets in here and builds up, and it should make it really strong. It's a little bit extra, but I'd rather overdo it than underdo it. But before I actually get too ahead of myself and I'm already covered in metal dust, I'm gonna go ahead and mark out a second one of these as a mirror and cut out of the other piece I have. Well, the camera died, and I know I'm bad about that, but I got the second one cut out. It's just a mirror of the first, obviously, and I also went ahead and cut out all of my little filler pieces. Now, the way these are going to sit in here is this one, obviously, is going to sit right about there, and this one's going to sit right about there, so with a little bit of angle on it so that everything, you know, can kind of run down out of it. Now, this was pretty difficult to do with an angle grinder. It took me quite a bit of time to do, and it was kind of just a pain in the ass. But I'm happy with how they turned out. They're pretty symmetrical. They look good. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these tacked in place, and then we can get them mocked up on the axle. Now, since I did start with box tubing, as you may know, there are some internal stresses in that stuff that was caused everything to be just a little tweaked. So I decided to throw them both in the vise at the same time so I can make sure everything stayed nice and straight. I went ahead and threw the link in there to make sure there was going to be plenty of room for travel, and there was, so it was time to get everything tacked in place. Now, you probably noticed how much the tips stick out like I was talking, so that's why on this last tack weld I decided to kind of bend it in place a little bit. This is how they turned out. They look pretty sweet in my opinion, so let's go get them welded on. Now, I was kind of hoping I could have kept those tabs, which is what holds the original brake line, but they fell right in the place of where my links needed to be. However, I am pretty happy I cleaned this axle up beforehand because it was a whole lot easier to cut through this paint than it was a bunch of rust. Once again, I went ahead and locked the tabs in place. That way everything was going to line up exactly where it wanted to be. Once again, there was actually a little bit of material that was causing everything to be thrown off, so just because I wanted it to be done right, I went ahead and ground it off. I actually ended up with a pretty perfect fit, which I was really happy about, and I knew it was nothing that I couldn't take care of with a welder. Once again, I made sure it was my desired distance away from the sea, then it was time to go ahead and get it tacked in place. Then on the other side, there's that tab I was talking about. As you can see, I had to rip it off, which is what it is. I'll come up with something else in the future. Luckily, they're just spot welded on, so there wasn't that much cleanup. Now, I gotta say, this little raw lock has been one of my favorite tools to have on this build. It's came in handy so many times. It's perfect for removing paint or getting a surface nice and clean for welding. Like I said earlier, I did use the same bar to weld on both tabs, so I knew everything was going to be nice and equal. I did actually flip it one time just in case I didn't get it welded back perfectly 90 degrees, but everything actually worked out fine. Once again, I needed to clean off a little bit of material as it didn't sit on the axle perfect, which was no big deal. I made sure it was the same distance as the other side was and went ahead and tacked it in place. I actually ended up thinking that this side fit a little bit better than the other side, so I'll take it. Alright, they're both tacked in place where they're going to be. They look really sweet in my opinion. I wonder how many times I've said that now. But whatever, they turned out pretty equal. I'm really happy with it. Now all I have to do is shorten up this link and then that will be done. Now, I did go ahead and clean everything up because I've got some other stuff to do this evening, but I'll be back at it again tomorrow. I wonder how many times I've said that. This truck's never getting finished. So it was the same process as before. I need to get the bushings out so that they didn't melt with all the heat of the grinding. Once again, taking my time going around the tube nice and even, not trying to cut too deep into anything until I finally get it to a point it'll just pop off. Then it was time to chop the bar off, taking 4 inches off this time because like I said, I shortened the other one an additional inch, so a total of 4. Cleaning the rod end up again so it's nice and circular and I can get a good weld on it, as well as adding a nice contour to the tube along with some bevels. Then I push the bushings back in so I can get everything nice and lined up. Went ahead and lined everything up using the hardware, which it actually turned out just about perfect the first time. Then I just needed to tighten it up so it would all be in its final spot. Then I just needed to throw some tacks on it, going a little extra heavy because I did not want this to move. And since all the hardware was nice and tight, I went ahead and tightened up the jam nuts on the tubes to lock them in position. And there we have it. All 4 link bars are in place where they're going to be. Everything is tacked in place. I am super happy with this. For my first suspension ever, I think it turned out really good. Now, this obviously isn't the most complicated suspension out there, but it's also far from the easiest. So I will definitely take this any day of the week. Now, to get it all finished off, we need to do the cross member like I've been talking about. And this is just going to simply be a piece of 1 3/4 tubing. It's what I have for my roll cage. It's going to go across. I'm going to have some plates that come off the bottom of it with a couple holes for variability that the tops of the coilovers will mount to. I gotta say, it was pretty nice buying all my roll cage tubing in bulk, but it's kind of a pain in the ass to have to get a 20-foot stick out just to cut 3 foot off, but it is what it is. So I went ahead and got my piece measured out, and since at this point in time in the video I only have an angle grinder, I decided to use a piece of paper and some tape to make a nice circle around the tube so I can get a nice concentric cut. And I just slowly spin the tube as I cut, going around and around until it cuts all the way through. Which did seem to work out pretty good, and I got it the perfect size first try. So I went ahead and kind of threw it in there just to get an idea of what it was going to look like. Well, after looking everything over, I realized that I am a huge idiot and my original plan is not going to work. You see, if I have a steady bar that goes across here with a bunch of holes in it, it is going to hit this part of the coilover. Now I could weld it on the back side of this bar, move the bar as far back as I can, and then run a spacer to the coilover, kind of like I did on the bottom, but I just don't like that. So now what I'm thinking I'm going to do is just make some tabs kind of like this. I'll weld one on the front, one on the back, and they will pinch the top of the coilover. More of how, you know, a proper coilover mount should be. Now the problem with this plan is that the bar is going to have to be, you know, over here a little bit more to line up with the center of the coilover. About like that. But then that puts me dangerously close to the hog of my diff. So I think I'm going to have to do a little bump out on the crossmember itself, kind of like on the front crossmember. This is going to be a lot of extra work, but I think it'll look cool and it'll be the best solution. Now this plan obviously means I will be losing my adjustability up here because I won't have a bunch of holes. I will have one that will be welded in place. But I really don't think I need that because I've already got 3 holes down here for adjustability and the coilover itself is adjustable. Plus I can just move this if I really need to. And at first I'll probably just heavily tack it in place, and then once the bed itself goes on and I've got all the weight back here, you know, the gas tank, etc., then I can move it to where I need and weld it in place. If I look at this side, which is the shorter side obviously, I think I can get away with about 11 inches before I need to bump up. So it will be from about that mark to about that mark, give or take. Well, on second thought, or third thought maybe, if I just use one piece like this and pinch it from just the side, you know, the same way the bottom is, I can weld it to the middle of the bar roughly, and then that means the bar can scoot back enough that I will have all the clearance I need. Now given this probably won't look as cool, but it keeps everything a lot more simpler, which is my end goal here. But that means I can go ahead and get this bar in place, get my tabs ready to go on, and then pretty much weld everything up, and it'll be ready to set back down on the ground. Now if you're thinking, you're a huge idiot, I like your first idea a whole lot better and your second one isn't going to work as well, I would agree with that. Now I did go ahead and do and film the second idea like I was talking about, as you'll see, but afterwards I did change my mind and I redid everything. I did that out of frustration with myself more than anything, so I didn't end up filming it, I just wanted to get it done. But the process of making the tabs was the exact same anyways, I just ended up making 2 more, so I figured I'd show it anyways. And before I actually welded these in place, I decided it was time to go ahead and do all of the welding on the truck itself. Now you guys get a nice sped up version, but this was probably an hour or 2 of just welding. For one, as you can obviously see, I decided to jump around a bunch to keep my heat distribution as equal as possible. I didn't want anything moving from where I already had it tacked in place. And on the crossmember, I actually decided to do all of my short welds first, meaning the 2-inch side, before I did the 4-inch side. And on my longer welds, like on the axle tabs, I decided to just do half at a time and then move around. The welds on the bottom side were definitely my least favorite because no matter how you do it or what you're wearing, you end up getting burnt. Filling those big gaps that I was talking about really wasn't too terrible. Like I said, I didn't want to put too much heat into it, so I just did a little bit of welding at a time, moved on to something else, and then came back to it. And after a painstaking amount of time, I was done, and I actually managed to get a couple good welds in, so I was pretty happy with it. Then it was back to the crossmember, or the old crappy crossmember. Went ahead and tacked the tabs in place where they were going to be. I think I guessed 8 inches away from the side, which wasn't too terribly off. I used some extra 1/4-inch plate I had laying around to space them up that extra 1/4 inch, which at the time lined everything up perfect. Now I actually wasn't able to get everything completely welded because where the axle was still welded into the truck with the angle iron, I couldn't access some spots. Now before I actually welded this in place, I decided to go ahead and cut the axle out because I didn't want it to be in my way trying to do so. This really wasn't too bad. I just took my time grinding away the tacks that I had made previously, trying not to go too deep into the sea. Then it just took some gentle persuasion with a hammer to knock them off. The bottom welds were bubblegummy enough I figured they would just break right off, and they did. The other side was a little more tricky because if you've ever used an angle grinder, you know that it's really easy to make left-hand cuts, but right-hand cuts you fight a little bit more because of the space of the angle grinder. Nevertheless, I got them all cut off good enough that I could hammer them off, and then the axle was free. Then I went ahead and pulled the coilovers off so I could get it dropped down and weld all of those places I was talking about I couldn't get to before. But of course, I had to get a look for how the travel on this thing works, and like I said, it is perfect. I'm so happy with this. Now, this was a really big milestone in this project. I was kind of scared for some reason that this triangulated 4-link suspension just wasn't going to work, but it did perfectly actually, and I was really happy with it. Alright, I know it's been a minute since I picked the camera up, but I've been trying to get this thing done, and it was well worth it because I am so happy right now. This suspension works fucking sweet. Now, obviously, it's really low right now, so I can finish my welds and everything like I was saying, but it is nice and solid left to right, not going anywhere, has a nice travel up and down without any binding. I'm going to finish getting all this welding done, weld my crossover bar in for my coilover so I can finally get this thing on the ground. Then it was just time for the really sketchy part of unhooking these upper links and flipping this heavy ass axle over to access where I needed to weld. I was taking my time, trying to be nice and gentle with it because it is quite heavy and I still screwed up and dropped it, but it wasn't no big deal. I ended up getting it back on the jack, lifted in the air, and spun over a little bit more, which I was going to call good enough because it was getting quite sketchy. But I could get to where I needed to weld, so it really didn't need to go anymore. Did a couple quick passes with the wire wheel because it rained in between now and then and everything was getting super rusty, but whatever. Then I just needed to lay the final beads. Once again, taking my time. I didn't want to put too much heat into them. It should have been fine considering everything else was already welded up, but it's better safe than sorry, so I jumped around a little bit. Then it was finally time to weld this boring ass cross member in. I made sure the C was nice and clean so I could get a good weld on it, which I did because I had to cut it back out and it was a pain in the ass, but moot point. I got it nice and level and then tacked in place, but then I got stopped because I feel like even God knew this wasn't what I should have been doing. Well, it started raining on me, go figure, right when I was starting to make some progress, but once it quits raining, we'll pick back up. Alright, looks like we caught a small break in the storm, so let's see if we can get this thing finished up. I decided to use my acetylene torch to get rid of all the water and dirt so I could get a nice good weld, and once again, I really did because it was a pain in the ass to cut back off. Now I jumped around a little bit here too, once again to keep the heat evenly distributed, but it was also kind of just uncomfortable to weld a full circle at once. Went ahead and made sure the tabs were nice and level for the time being. And I know I've been complaining about this a lot because I'm still frustrated about it to this day, but as you'll see, it did still work out good for the time being. Well, I once again got rained out, but I got the bar all welded in, got the tabs welded on, went ahead and bolted everything back up, and I kind of hate it. So after measuring everything, this axle with no weight on it, meaning it's free hanging on the shocks, sits about 5 inches from the C. Now remember, my desired ride height is 3 inches from the C. If I jack it up like it is right now, I think I'm about 4.5, 4 3/4 inches, which is no surprise considering that the rear of this thing weighs nothing right now. But the problem is that if the bed and the gas tank and, the rest of the weight that needs to go back here, if that doesn't weigh enough to drop it the rest of the way to 3 inches, then I'm going to have to move some stuff around to make the distance a little bit shorter. But the thing is, if I went ahead and made it, out here more to where it was already shorter, then I wouldn't have that much droop distance. If I'm sitting at 3-inch ride height and 4 inches with no weight on the axle, that's only 1 inch it can go when I hit a bump or something. Whereas right now it has about 2 inches, which I think is a lot better. So while I'm not super happy with it, I am going to run with it for now because it's already in there and I'm just going to kind of hope and pray that there's enough weight in the rear of this thing to get me my desired ride height. However, I think for now, since I want this thing to be back on the ground and be a roller, I'm just going to get some ratchet straps and ratchet strap it up to my 3-inch ride height again and set it down on the ground so I can see how low it's going to be. I do need to hurry this up though because it's about to rain again. I swear I can't catch a break. Now I do apologize if all this jumping around is a little confusing. It was confusing me during the time of making it, which, correlates. But it just goes to show that this is my first time ever doing anything like this and I just don't know what I'm doing simply, and I was learning as I go. So trying to keep everything nice and consistent as one even video was a little challenging, but I'm only going to get better with time. Now once again, I was kind of just, overthinking everything here, and I put that ratchet strap on thinking it was going to help me at least hold my desired ride height for the time being, but you'll see in a minute that wasn't the case, and I actually did better work than I even thought I did. Now I will say that this truck was kind of sketchy to set back down. Everything being at such a high distance, and with this jack not wanting to roll on the asphalt at all, I ended up kind of dropping it once, but it's fine. I ended up getting it. Now I really can't explain just how happy I was to get this truck set back down on the ground because it is now lower than it has ever been the entire time I've owned it, and it finally felt like all my hard work was worth it. Well, this thing's low as shit. And I still plan on the front coming down a little bit too, but I'm actually sitting on bump stops that can't go any lower. And I measured, I'm 4 inches off the ground, which for this little truck and the things I plan on doing with it is perfect. Now when it comes to everything I was just saying about back here, I'm stupid and I take it all back. With the whole weight of the truck sitting well on itself, everything actually works out just about perfect. I'm actually sitting at the perfect 3-inch ride height that I desire, and I couldn't be happier. It moves up and down and does suspension things as it should. The axle doesn't move left or right. I checked when I was up in the air. So as far as this triangulated 4-link goes, it was a success. Now I still am a little bit unhappy with how I did this with the single shear, so I think I might still move the crossmember over a little bit, do a little bump up to go over my hog and just make it a double shear and clean everything up a little bit. And then I do still plan on running a sway bar or any roll bar, so I need to figure out exactly how I'm gonna do that, what I'm gonna use, and where it's gonna tie into. But that'll be a different video. For now, it's back on the ground on its own weight. It's really low, so I'm gonna call that a success for this video. Once again, thank you guys for watching. If you would like and subscribe and all that crap, it would mean a whole lot to me. Or tell your friends about me if, you know, they like LS Swap shit boxes. And I'll see you on the next one.